Hey everyone, great to have you back. I hope you had a good festive season. I hope you had a good start to 2024. Today's episode is one from the archives. At the end of the year, I got a bunch of data points from Spotify about how the show was doing. And one thing that I was really curious to see that I don't see on a daily or weekly basis is what was the episode that was shared the most. And I think that tells a lot about what really touches people, what really moves them. Well, the answer was episode 11 with Helen Fisher on sex, love, and monogamy. So I thought maybe it's worth sharing one more time. I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that you get an excellent start to 2024. This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. Anthropology is full of wonderful stories of just how much cultures can differ, but sometimes the opposite happens. My favorite example of this comes from Irenaeus Eibel Eibesfeld, the Austrian ethologist who recounted a story about a discussion he had with a recently contacted tribe. So after inquiring into the life ways of the tribe, he asked them if they would want to ask him something. And they did. He quote, "Does it ever happen amongst your people that someone who is married has sex with someone else?" Now, apparently this bizarre occurrence was relatively common amongst the tribe's people, and it caused a lot of misery and conflict when it did happen. And I'm sure we could draw many lessons from this, but the lesson that I want to focus on is that with all its beauty and ugliness, for better or worse, romantic love goes deeper than culture. But what exactly does go deeper than culture? I mean, something does, I believe. But I've never been really satisfied when I hear folk theories about what is the biologically natural mating system for humans. It's not that there aren't many folk theories out there. I can give a list. There are those who say that we evolved to be like bonobos and have pansexual relations with everyone without any exclusive sexual access to anyone. There are those who think that we are gorillas, where males are naturally inclined to gather a large harem of females to whom he will have exclusive sexual access to. And then there are those romantics who look to swans and say that lifelong monogamy is what is natural for our species. Beyond animal analogies, there are those who look into Darwinian logic and say that, at least for heterosexual lovers, there is a fundamental compatibility that emerges from our evolutionary past, the fact that males are programmed to want more sex and females more emotional connection. Helen Fisher thinks that none of these claims is correct, at least not the whole story, and she speaks with some authority. Trained as an anthropologist, Fisher has read extensively about romantic love across the globe, but she has also become a pioneering figure in the neuroscience of love. And more recently, as the chief science advisor to Match.com, she has been able to do huge studies on the American population, representative samples of the American population. It's kind of samples that normally would be completely out of reach due to financial reasons from typical psychologists. And so I invited Fisher on the podcast to discuss the nature of sex, love, and monogamy. This is one of the most wide-ranging conversations I've had, and it is the longest one. We start by discussing Fisher's theory about the so-called natural mating system for humans, which is not polygamy, but neither is it lifelong, strict monogamy. Of course, what is quote-unquote natural for us is not necessarily what people want from their individual lives. So I was also very happy to talk about Fisher's research into what makes lifelong monogamous marriages work when people do want them to work. We also discuss issues such as what happens to mating when women and not men amass large wealth in societies, and why some antidepressants might blunt feelings of romantic love. The latter topic is very important, I believe, but it's also worth noting that we are not recommending anyone to drop their medication, especially not without first consulting with their doctor. If this is a topic that you're interested in, though, for yourself or for someone close to you, and you want to have more information before talking about it with a medical professional, I have left some relevant links in the show notes. In the show notes, you will also find a full list of technical terms and names mentioned in this conversation. I hope that you enjoyed the episode. I bring to you Helen Fisher. Professor Helen Fisher, welcome to the podcast.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you.
I think it was during my undergrad years that I first encountered the claim that romantic love is hardly a human universal. It's rather the invention of 12th century European troubadours. I have to say that I kind of struggled ever taking that very seriously, but should I?
when people say that this was some invention of the troubadours in the 12th century, I mean, they've never read ancient Egyptian poetry, or Sumerian poetry or Arabian. I mean, almost everywhere in the world, there's a Romeo and Juliet story. There's a famous one in China. I think it's called The Jade Goddess. I wrote about it in one of my books. And it's about a young girl from a rich, noble family who falls in love with the gardener, and he is a good at carving jade. And they run off together, and of course, this really annoys her family. And they finally catch them. He gets away. They bury her alive in the family garden. And when you take a look around the world at the incredible amount of just basic artifacts, you would never, ever assume that this was in the 12th, started in the 12th century.
What about anthropologically when people have studied romantic love around the world? Do they find it everywhere?
Yes, they do, and in fact, one of the first person was Bill Jankovic, and it was interesting, I was talking with Bill years and years ago. He ended up looking now over 200 cultures, and he found evidence of romantic love in every one. But when I first met him at a conference, and I was asking him about romantic love in China, and he said, "No, no, no, they don't do that." And I was staggered. And then he wrote me, went back to China doing more of his, ethnographic work, and apparently he asked his assistant whether, the assistant had ever been in love or knew what this was about, and the assistant, I'm not sure whether the assistant started to cry. But either he or she, I can't remember the whole story, said, "Oh, yes, I mean, my partner left me, I'm bereft, I don't know what to do," et cetera, and then Bill began to realize, "Oh, yes." And so then he did, his first, big book on this was he collected data on, I think, 186 cultures, it may have been 168 cultures, it was a long time ago, and he found some evidence of romantic love in every single one. And there were various cultures where he asked, and people would say, "No, no, no, we don't believe in that." And then they will say to him, "Well, think of it, I knew this guy a couple of years ago who hung himself, from a palm tree because his girlfriend wouldn't marry him." And so, I mean, when I started this, people really did not believe that this was a brain system, and we've been able to prove that it is a very powerful brain system that evolved millions of years ago.
I've heard you say that the more you've studied the brain, the more you've thought that actually this is not love is not even an emotion, it's a drive. What do you mean by
Well, I had assumed that it was an emotion, or a whole series of emotions that go from high to low and swinging this way and that, from jealousy to joy to despair to thrill, et cetera, et cetera. And so I remember where I was when I was walking through Washington Square Park, thinking to myself, "Why don't I put people in brain scanners and see if, I can find the brain circuitry of this?" And I did assume at that time that it was an emotion or a series of emotions from high to low. Anyway, when we put the people in the brain scanner, my first study with my colleagues, we put 17 people into the scanner who had just fallen madly and happily in love. And, as it turns out, sure, there was activity in various limbic areas orchestrated by the a part of the emotions, and certainly part of the cerebral cortex where you do your thinking and decision making. But all of these people we put in the machine showed activity in a tiny little factory near the very base of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. And that little brain region is in the whole drive part of the brain, and it makes dopamine, produces dopamine, and then sends dopamine to many brain regions, giving you that elation, that focus, that motivation, the optimism, the intense craving of romantic love. And what you say, is it a drive? It lies right next to the hypothalamus, which orchestrates thirst and hunger. The hypothalamus and the pituitary lying right next to the ventral tegmental area, and they orchestrate a lot of the fundamental drives, including thirst and hunger. And when I first saw that, I began to realize, oh, wow, sure, there's lots of emotions involved, but it's basically a human drive, a drive that evolved millions of years ago to just make you fixate on a particular individual and stick with them at least long enough to send their DNA into tomorrow.
Can I ask actually, when you say that you study romantic love in the brain scanner, do you mean it in the broad sense of love between, romantically attracted individuals, or in the narrow sense when you divide love into three components, where there is the sex drive, which there is the romantic drive, and then the passion, and then there is the deep attachment. When we're talking about romantic love being associated with the VTA, do you mean it in the broad sense of having all of those three, or in the narrow sense of being the number two of those components?
It's in the narrow sense, number 2. And in fact, when I would put people in the machine and I would coach them on what to think about, because you can't have any surprises in this machine. You can't have people being fearful of what's gonna happen next. They gotta know what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
It's not a nice place to be in, I have to say.
no, it's not a nice place to be, and I'm claustrophobic, and I've always felt terrible sympathy, but they wanna go in the machine, they're fascinated. I mean, I would put big flyers around on various campuses around New York, and I would say, "Have you just fallen happily in love? Please help science," etcetera, etcetera. But anyway, the sex drive is predominantly orchestrated by testosterone in both men and women. Romantic love, which is the one that I initially studied, is largely orchestrated by the dopamine system in the ventral tegmental area. And the third brain system of attachment, we've located some of the basic places where that is generated. And one of them is called the ventral pallidum. And this third brain system of attachment is really orchestrated by oxytocin and vasopressin. So basically, there are 3 different systems, largely orchestrated by 3 different neurochemical systems. Sex drive gets you out there looking for a whole range of partners. I mean, you can have sex with somebody, without ever being in love with them. Romantic love enables you to focus your mating energy on just one at a time, and then that 3rd brain system of attachment enables you to stick with this person at least long enough to raise a single child through infancy. So the 3 different brain systems, I'm very glad you mentioned it, and they can really come in any order. Some people assume, "Oh, it starts with sex, then you fall in love, and then you feel the deep attachment." That's not true. These are brain systems. They're not phases. And so a lot of people can fall madly in love with somebody that they've never had sex with, and in fact, fall madly in love with somebody who they never have sex with. Or you can begin by feeling deep attachment to somebody in school, somebody at work, somebody in your social group, and only 2 years later begin to court them and then trigger that brain circuitry for romantic love and then have sex with them. So there are 3 different systems. They can operate in any pattern. And of course, I regard all 3 as important to a good marriage.
Hmm. I cannot resist the temptation to ask. I mean, you have your tripartite theory of the brain systems of love. We interviewed Robert Sternberg recently. He has his own tripartite theory of love, where love is a component of liking, of passion, and of commitment. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is necessarily in any way an opposite view that needs to be argued with your view. But what do you think of Sternberg's triangular theory of love? Is it something that
He's a psychologist. I'm a
Mm,
brain scan.
mm,
And, when you talk about those 3, the commitment, I think I mean, when you're making a commitment to somebody, you probably feel deeply attached to them, and the brain circuitry for attachment, the oxytocin, vasopressin, system is cranking up
mm,
to so that people express the commitment that he's talking about. In terms of the passion, I don't know whether he means romantic passion or sexual passion.
mm.
Um
Probably both or either. Mm,
yeah, and in that and I they are different,
mm,
but they go together. I mean, when you have sex with somebody, any stimulation of the genitals drives up the dopamine system, and you can fall in love with them. And then with orgasm, there's a real flood of oxytocin and vasopressin, and you can feel deep attachment to them. So I'd have to ask him whether he means a sexual passion or romantic passion, but he certainly is right. I mean, I do think that in good relationships, it's nice to have both. And what was this third one that he talked about?
So it's commitment, liking, and passion.
Liking. And my guess is that the liking is also associated with the oxytocin
Mm,
system of attachment. I mean, when you like somebody, I do think that you feel a sense of attachment to them and even commitment to them.
mm.
So my guess is, so many of people have intuitively figured this out. and then they divide it up the way they want to divide it up. I like a great deal of psychology. I'm just trying to add the brain component. I'm not ever trying to dislodge or disprove them. Psychology is good. There's a lot of great psychology, but I'm trying to add the second half of the puzzle. Creates that sense of liking. I think it's oxytocin and vasopressin. What creates that passion? Well, if he's talking about the sex drive, it's going to be testosterone and dopamine. If he's talking about romantic love, it's going to be just dopamine. But that's the underlying physiological mechanisms that are creating the Sternberg the three aspects of love. He's a psychologist. I'm a neuroscientist and anthropologist. We can go together.
Two technical questions about the brain science of love that I do want to ask. One is that you mentioned that the sex drive is related to testosterone. I think that there's a kind of easy fallacy to jump from that conclusion to the conclusion. Sorry, from that premise to the conclusion that, well, because men have significantly higher levels of testosterone, they also need to have a significantly higher sex drive. Uh, I first of all heard you say that that's not the case. My question is, I guess, first of all, what's the data on that not being the case? Because I also do believe it not being the case, but what's the data on it? But also, secondly, how can it be that if it is related to testosterone so deeply, why is it not so that because men just in brute terms have more testosterone
Yeah.
in their bodies, they also end up having a higher sex drive?
Okay. So first of all, it's not the amount of a chemical, it's the amount of receptors that receive it
Uh-huh.
in which parts of the brain. It's much more complicated than just levels. That's why I never say levels of dopamine, levels of serotonin, levels of testosterone. I say the activity of these chemical systems. It's easy to say levels, but that's not accurate. Women definitely do have less testosterone, but that does not mean that the activity in their neural systems is any less active. So we got it right there. Now, young people, it's very interesting. Male sex drive, I think, comes on a little sooner. What I have read, and I don't study this, but what I've
Yeah.
read when I study other things is that male sex drive really almost peaks in their late teens, 19, 20, 21, whereas female sexuality and sex drive apparently peaks a little bit later around age 25. Now, I could be wrong, but this is what I had read.
Mm.
In which case, when most psychologists are studying teenagers, they're studying people in colleges and they're studying
Yes,
people in
yes. I see where this
colleges
is going.
and they're studying 145 undergrads who are 18, 19, 20. And of course, you're going to get whatever your sample population is, you're going to get the data that says that. And then I study huge populations. I mean, I have data on 55,000 Americans, ages 18 to 71 plus. And I'll get to that in a minute. But the bottom line is, it's so interesting that, a lot of middle aged women apparently lose a lot of their interest in their husband. And that is apparently relatively standard. However, it is my prediction, and I don't recommend it, but if those women just got a different partner, their sex drive would come back. In other words, they're bored, they're with somebody who's alcoholic or emotionally abusive or too busy or everything has become so standard, and they're bored. So you've got to take into account the environment. There's a lot of women after menopause actually become much more sexual, and they become more sexual because after menopause, with menopause, levels of estrogen are declining, and so are levels of testosterone. But the estrogen declines so much more than the testosterone that the testosterone begins to be unmasked and express itself. And you will
Mm.
see middle-aged women becoming more assertive, even more ambitious, a little more hair on the face, putting more weight on around the stomach, which are all testosterone related. And so you often hear about older women who are more randy and sexually active than their partners. And so you've got to take a look at the sex drive across the entire spectrum of the human lifespan.
Mm.
And you've got to also do it in other cultures. There are some wonderful studies of all hunter-gatherer people. And there's one study of, I think it's 96 traditional historical hunting and gathering herding societies. And scientists have done meta-analysis looking at all these
Mm.
cultures. They ended up finding that in over 80% of these societies or 75% of these societies, when they went in and asked men and women who was the more sexual, they agreed that women were just as sexual as men. Now, in hunting and gathering societies, women are very economically powerful. They commute to work to gather their fruits and vegetables. They come home with 60 to 80% of the evening meal very regularly, always over 50% of it. And they are regarded as sexually, socially, and economically powerful. And in those cultures, they seem to express the same degree of sexuality as men. Then we began to settle down on the farm. Men's roles became much more important, moving the rocks, felling the trees, plowing the land, taking the produce off to local markets, and coming home with the equivalent of money. And women's roles became less powerful. They couldn't go off the farm and do their foraging. Their new job was having lots of babies to help them pick, weed, prune, prepare the evening meals, etc. And along with the rise of that, about 10,000 years ago, we see a whole lot of beliefs about a woman, what a woman is. She's not as sexual as men. uh, Virginity at marriage, arranged marriages. The man is the head of the household, till death do us part. And so for the last 10,000 years, we've had this belief, and Darwin had it too. He thought women were very nice and cuddly, but
Mm, mm,
he didn't think they were as smart as men or as business wise as men, and probably not as sexual. And
mm.
so you've got to take so many things into account before you can, with any kind of confidence, say that men are more sexual. And so, as you know, I'm chief science advisor to the dating site Match.com. And every year, I don't deal with their site, I deal with their science. And every single year I do, so this is my 12th year. I'm going to go down to Dallas next week, actually, and discuss it with them. But every year, I and my colleagues create about 200 questions. And we do not poll the matched members. It's a national representative sample of singles based on the US Census. We collect data on 5,000 plus people around the country: Black, white, Asian, Latino, gay, straight, rural, suburban, urban, everywhere, and every sexual orientation. And as it turns out, men fall in love faster than women do. They fall in love more often than women do. When men meets a woman that he is in love with, he introduces her to friends and family sooner. Men are 2.5 times more likely to kill themselves when a relationship is over. But one thing that I found, now, men are more interested in one night stands than women are. And so that's another thing. What people say, oh, well, that's because men want to just screw around. So I asked men and women in this Singles in America dating study, why do you do a one night stand? And men were 3 times more likely than women to say, I do it because I think it will lead to a relationship.
Really?
Isn't that fascinating? We don't understand men in this culture. We don't understand women in this culture. And we have no idea what we're talking about when we say that men have a higher sex drive. None at all.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I mean, I also remember you saying that when you've done brain scanning experiments on around the world, the romantic love, neural footprint of romantic love is the same whether you look at men or women or whether you look at heterosexual or homosexual. That it
It's
is
exactly the same. I mean, this is a system like hunger and thirst. Everywhere in the world, doesn't matter whether you're from Nigeria or Beijing or Tierra del Fuego or Toronto or Finland. This is a basic brain system, and it doesn't matter. Bottom line is, everywhere in the world, people feel love.
Mm.
Pine for love, live for love, kill for love, and die for love. Basic brain system. We did exactly the same study in Beijing as we did in New York, and we found exactly the same activity in this ventral tegmental area.
I have to ask, were there any cultural modulations? Because I was actually a student member in a cultural neuroscience lab in Peking University for a while. And so, I mean, I've seen like paper after paper after paper of how culture can modulate early visual perception. And, they're the classic difference. East Asians look more at the periphery of the image, Westerners more at the focal object in the image. And I mean, it just, the list goes on and on and on. So, is it really so that the list kind of stops at romantic love? That's something where you basically don't find cultural modulation, or is it so that you do find cultural modulation of the brain activity, but you would say that it's peripheral in a sense that it's not central to what you see in the brain when you study the folks?
Culture always plays a role. Now, the basic feeling of romantic love is the same. It's actually pretty much similar to the same attraction system in rats and prairie voles and sheep. This is
Mm.
a basic brain system. In animals, I call it,
Animal magnetism.
yes, thank you, animal magnetism. I just made that one up, but it's true. So, but culture always is gonna mold how that brain system is affected. Now, let's give an example of religiosity. There's a gene in the serotonin system linked with religiosity. It's also called self transcendence, the ability to believe in something way outside of human
Mm.
experience. There is a specific gene in the serotonin system linked with religiosity. Now, you grow up in New York City, you're likely to be a Christian. You grow up in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, you're going to be a Muslim. You grow up in Bhutan, you're going to be a Buddhist. So, in other words, these are basic brain systems, and then the culture molds them. So, in other words, romantic love hasn't changed for 4 million years, probably more. But courtship has, and courtship will continue to change. I mean, today, most people are meeting their first date on the internet. Well, in my day, there was no internet. And so we met at school or work or through friends, etc. So courtship will always change. Feeling of romantic love will remain. It's primordial, it's adaptable, and it's eternal. It's going to be around as long as we survive as a species and probably a lot longer.
Well, that's a great way to transition to the next broad topic, because I think that in a way, or the point about the romantic love being the invention of 12th century troubadours, it's almost a straw man. I mean, some people might believe it, but as I said, I even struggle to take it seriously. But I think that many more people would be willing to say that, okay, well, maybe romantic love, yes, that exists, but anything resembling our ideals of monogamy are a cultural invention. And I think that this is an area where I found your work to be extremely clarifying. I mean, to the extent that even if somebody doesn't agree with the conclusions, I think that just walking through the steps in the way that you do is just incredibly clarifying. And I thought that maybe we can try to do that together. So let me ask you, if we break down the components of what would be possible answers to is monogamy natural, I guess the first thing to notice would be that it's easier to ask whether pair bonding is natural than whether monogamy is natural. Now, could you give some examples of what would be an animal that demonstrates pair bonding besides humans, and what would be an animal that does not?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's define what monogamy is. Mono means one, and gamy means spouse, one
Hmm.
spouse. It does not mean sexual fidelity. And so that we use it, academics who deal with this, ethologists basically, talk about social monogamy. In other words, socially, they forming a partnership, a pair bond, which is they build a nest together,
Yes.
they protect their young together, they clean up their young together, they snuggle together. It's a social pair bond. I mean, so anyway, to answer your question, what kind of other animal is a pair-bonded animal? 3%, only 3% of mammals form partnerships, pair bonds. About 20% of primates do. So probably because so many of them live in the trees, you got to have somebody take care of those babies or they'll fall out of the trees.
Oh, I
Uh,
see.
and some of them will have a baby too soon after the last one, so they're always stuck in this thing. But anyway, over 90% of birds form pair bonds. Most birds form a series of partnership. They meet at a nest, they have their sex, they sit on their eggs, and they work as a pair to raise the young. But when the young fly away, the pair bond breaks up. They do not for robins, and I guess you would call them a thrush, but a robin, it's a standard American bird. And in the spring they show up, they form a partnership, they raise the babies, but when the babies fly away, they join a large group, a flock, and they head down to Mexico for the winter. And then they come back and they may well pair together, but they may not. They may choose a different partner. One might die, one doesn't show up, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a series of partnerships. And that's what you see in most birds, a series of pair bonded partnerships. So the academic term would be serial monogamy, really serial social monogamy, because the vast majority of the words birds do cheat. And scientists have gone in and taken some of the DNA out of the eggs and find that a certain percentage of those eggs are not the eggs of the male that is feeding them. So it's serial social monogamy or pair bonding, and also clandestine adultery.
Just there actually, before, while we're building up the case for what is the most natural mating system for humans, in your opinion, could you quickly talk about red foxes a little bit? I found it fascinating.
Oh, sure. That's a perfect example. Love writing about these animals. And foxes, like all of the wild, the dogs, the wolf, the coyotes, they all form pair bonds, but they're not for life. And foxes are a very good example. In the breeding season, in the middle of the winter, there's about 20 days in February, and the male can smell the female. She's come into estrus or heat, and he follows her, dutifully follows her, snuggles up next to her. Even when he's hungry, he'll catch a little mouse or something and feed it to her. It's not unlike two people sitting on a park bench, snuggling with each other.
And he brings food to her a lot, right? I mean, I remember he said that he might almost be on the point of starving because he shares so much of the food with her.
Exactly. And they're snuggling, they're charming. And not unlike two teenagers or two old people. I mean, the human brain circuitry for romantic love doesn't die with age. So, anyway, and they have their babies. They split the job. He goes out and collects, food and feeds her. Somebody's got to stick with those babies. That's the way they form pair bonds. You see pair bonding in species where a female cannot raise her babies by herself. That's the main key to why animals form long-term or short-term partnerships. Because now, for example, a female mouse has very thick milk, and so she can feed those babies herself. The babies conk out from all of this rich milk. She can go feed herself and then come. She doesn't need a partner to help her rear the young. But among foxes, the milk is very thin. The babies have to be fed all the time. And so somebody's got to stick with them, and at first it's going to be the female. So the male goes out, he does collect small mammals and feeds his basic wife and children. And then as the babies get older, he sticks with the babies and she goes out and collects larger goodies for the children. But the bottom line is, as the summer wanes and those babies trot off, the pair bond breaks up. They will not stay together through the for the autumn and until the next breeding season. And at that point, they may meet up again. They may not meet up again. So it's a series of pair bonding or monogamous relationship. And by the way, you are quite right. I always stick to the word pair bonding because people don't understand the word monogamy. They assume it's fidelity and they assume it's lifelong. No ethologist makes those two assumptions.
So, okay, so let's take stock. I mean, first of all, the whole discussion we had about romantic love just demonstrates that we are not like chimpanzees, nor are we like bonobos, who
Right.
have a lot of wonderful characteristics, but don't seem to have these long-term relations.
Yeah.
They have a lot of sex and they have a great sex drive, but there doesn't seem to be these long-term relationships around it. Um, on the other hand, it's not at all clear that the fact that we have pair bonds entails that these have to be lifelong pair bonds. And if I've understood, please correct me if I'm paraphrasing wrong here, but you would say that we're certainly not like chimpanzees and bonobos, but nor are we necessarily like swans, at least in prehistory. What you would say was natural for humans would be to do a little bit of what the foxes are doing, except because human babies require much more care, much more prolonged care. It wouldn't be one mating season, it would be something like 4 years.
Yeah. I was really wondering why we divorce. That's what, I had written a whole book on why we bothered to pair up at all. And, I traced that back to the coming down out of the trees, the evolution of standing on 2 feet, to carry sticks and stones and food back to a central location where you could eat unmolested by predators, evolution of carrying and walking. I didn't see how a female could have carried sticks and stones and protected herself in the very open environment. She needed a partner to help her at least while she was carrying a child. 4 million years ago, a woman's carrying a lot around very dangerous open grasslands with the equivalent of carrying in her arms instead of on her back, the equivalent of a 20-pound bowling ball. Well, how are you going to protect yourself? So we went over what I call a monogamy threshold,
Mm.
where it became essential for females and suitable for males. And we evolved the long-term brain circuitry for romantic love and attachment. So then I began to think to myself, now hang on here. Why is it that you fall madly in love, you move in together, you meld your families, your natal families, you build a lot of friends. Why do we divorce? I mean, why do we do it? So I decided I would look at divorce around the world. And I went to the demographic yearbooks of the United Nations, and they, from 1947 to 2011, data on marriage and divorce. And what I found in 80 cultures around the world is three things. People tend to divorce in their middle 20s, about age 25, 26, maybe gotten a little later now. What was it? And the big thing is with one child. People with no children divorce a lot. People with one child really divorce quite a bit.
Hmm.
And then the more children you have, the less like you are to divorce. But this was very standard to see a large number. I can't remember the data right now. It's in my book, Anatomy of Love, but I haven't talked about this. What's nice about you is we're really talking about something that I've cared about forever, and most people don't ask me. They're interested in the family and the pandemic and all that, which is perfectly fine. I've got a lot of data on it. But the bottom line is this was very special to me. Around the world, if you're going to divorce, you tend to divorce between between the third and fourth year of marriage, and often with a single child and in your middle 20s. And I thought to myself, I was horribly disappointed because I thought to myself, oh, well, there's this 7 year ish. Wouldn't it be logical to divorce after you've had two children? So you have replaced yourselves. And the second child is out of infancy. Why do people divorce around the fourth year of marriage rather than the seventh? And it suddenly occurred to me. I remember where I was standing. I was reaching over an hors d'oeuvre tray up in Columbia at a conference, and it suddenly occurred to me, hang on, Helen, maybe we were originally built, predisposed millions of years ago to form a partnership and stay together only through the infancy of one child
Yes.
rather than two.
Like the foxes.
Yeah, they'll one litter. They have one litter, so it's more than one child. But yes, one litter. Uh, And it suddenly occurred to me, oh, 4 years is the period of time in hunting and gathering societies that it takes to nurse a child until it's walking and can join a multi-age playgroup. So both parents are a little bit more able to move on if they can, because the whole group can take care of the child. And the advantage of that millions of years ago is they would go on, find a new partner, and have more babies and create more genetic variety in their young. And in a very unstable environment, which a lot of our past was, it would probably be adaptive to have children by more than one partner. I mean, with one partner, child is going to be very well coordinated and have good eyesight. With the next one, the child's going to have a wonderful sense of humor and get everybody doing things their way, et cetera, et cetera. And, even today, I'll give a speech at a conference, and a woman or man will come up to me and say, oh, I was a failure at love. And I say, oh, what do you mean? And they'll say, well, I don't know. I mean, I had three wives or I had three husbands. And my first question is, oh, how many children did you have? And they will say, oh, I had two children with the first wife and one with the second. And from a Darwinian perspective, that is adaptive. This concept of serial partnerships for millions of years would have enabled our forebears to create more genetic variety in their lineage, leaving in people today this predisposition for restlessness and long partnerships.
One theme, though, that is important is to distinguish between what is, good from the macro Darwinian perspective to the individual, and what is good for the individual within their actual, for their happiness, for the things that they desire for. And I think that one of the sad things is that I don't know if the divorce pattern in hunter-gatherer communities today is exactly this kind of a predictable. After 4 years, they probably break up. But what I do remember from looking at some of the stats is that divorce is very common there. It's not at all the kind of a big deal
Very
that
common. They apparently have two to three husbands during the course of their lives.
I think here's the thing, that's all well and good when you have the kind of community structure that hunter-gatherers live in, where it is not a great burden on the children. And I think that one of the kind of tragedies of modernity is that we have created a situation where I mean, some of the reasons that lifelong bonding has become socially the norm are the uglier ones that you already hinted at when talking about how agriculture made women less powerful, made women more the property of men, etc. But I mean, there is also like from a very modern contemporary perspective, it just isn't as easy to break up and
Yeah.
have kids not notice it in the same way than it is in a hunter-gathering community where the cooperative childcare is the norm. You know, the uncles and the aunties are there, and probably the mom and the dad are still there. And you know, okay, now they're not together. I mean, it's not that big of a deal, which it can be a huge deal in the kind of more isolated nuclear families that we live in nowadays, and it could put a terrible burden on the children. And I think that kind of is one of the tragedies, I think, is that I really appreciated this realization that no, divorce is not unnatural. It's not just a product of the 20th century hedonism. But on the other hand, what is a product of 20th century is the situation where divorces are so difficult for the children.
Well, first of all, it's difficult for everybody. It's not just the children, but difficult for everybody. And I just want to say I'm not in the good bad business. I'm in the business of trying to understand why people do what they do. So I never use what you should do, what's good, what's bad, what's cetera. But you touch on very important points. In hunting and gathering societies, they lived in these little groups of probably about 25 individuals. Then they would join other bands at the dry season, etc. And, sure, there were an awful lot of people to take care of the children after they were out of infancy. The other thing is in hunting and gathering societies, a child is already part of a particular clan.
Hmm.
And so nobody's gonna have any fight about who owns the children or where the children will live. So that's number 1. Number 2, they don't have any property. So they don't have to fight over who gets the dog and the cat, who gets the cooking utensils, who gets the this and that. I mean, no, the men don't want a digging stick and the women don't know how to do a bow and arrow. I mean, so they don't have all that property. So there's no question about it that the cultural paraphernalia that comes along with divorce in hunting gathering society is vastly reduced. But if you read ethnographies, and right behind me, you can see a whole list of them back there. Divorce is no easier than it is today. People fight, they kill each other, everybody gets involved, and it can be extremely disruptive. Now, I think, I read about divorce all my life, and I think one of the best summary feelings when you take a look at hunter gatherers around the world, the feelings about divorce were summed up in a book about the Mongol people of Siberia. And they said, if two people cannot get along harmoniously together, they had better live apart. And that's what an awful lot of people with little amount of property would feel because they can't afford to disrupt the entire community with people fighting and pushing and yelling and threatening each other. So bottom line is for millions of years, anthropologists do feel that people did have about 2 to 3 long-term partnerships, marriages, and of course, we still have that today.
Hmm.
And just like you said, it's an issue of property. It's very hard to divorce. It's always hard psychologically for everybody, but the amount of property, the amount of financial issues, and the lack of support for children is certainly there. But I would like to say something very positive about the future. Everybody's so glum about it. I think that we're heading towards a relative family stability. As I say, I have data on 55,000 Americans, and 89% of singles today do believe that when you find the right person, you can remain married for life. But what's most important to me is what happened during this pandemic. A bottom line is Cupid beat COVID. What I mean is, as much as those awful things that happened during this pandemic, people grew up. I call it post traumatic growth. And in 2019, before this pandemic, I asked the question to 5,000 singles, every age, every background, would you want to marry somebody? Would you want to meet somebody who wants to get married? 58% of singles in 2019 said, yes, I'd like to meet somebody who wants to marry. In 2021, as the pandemic was winding down, I asked the same question. Would you like to meet somebody who wants to marry? And this time, rather than 58% saying yes, 76% said yes.
Hmm.
You can't lock up people for 2 years and let them out and think they're the same. Bad boys are out, bad girls are out. 70% of men want to meet and settle down with somebody within the next year. 60% of women do. The most likely to want to find a long-term committed partnership are the very young, people of reproductive age. Gen Z says that 81% of them want to find somebody in the next year, and 76% of millennials. These are people of reproductive age, and they want to meet somebody who wants to marry. They now want to meet somebody who is the same level of education, who makes the same amount of money, who has a successful career. The young today are very serious. These are not lollygagging around, and even they do their friends with benefits, certainly. And when I asked the question, have you ever had a friends with benefits relationship turn into a long-term partnership? And 45% said yes. It's just a new way of meeting, a new way of getting to know you. But we are not only predisposed to settle down, but because of this dreadful pandemic, singles have sobered up. And I think, well, it's one of the reasons that I think we're going to relative family stability. I call it slow love. Not only are they interested in settling down, but they're doing it very methodically. In my day, 60s and 70s, people were marrying in their very early 20s. Now they're married in their very late 20s or early 30s. There's this long period of what I call the pre-commitment stage, in which they're getting to know themselves, they're trying people out, they're getting rid of what they don't want, and they are trying again. And there's a great deal of data, not only in the demographic yearbooks of the United Nations, but in a study of 3,000 Americans, that the later you marry, the more likely you are to stay married. And this is exactly what we are seeing.
Mm.
We're not only looking for stable partnerships because of this pandemic, but we are marrying them much later. Both of those trends suggest that we could be heading for relative family stability.
Yeah, I love the idea that the kind of casualness of modern dating and sex life is not it's not necessarily the same as lack of caution, in the sense it is actually a source of caution.
That's right.
People want to try, they want to learn, they want to experience, and they're not going to settle down with the first one. And I think a statistic that was very surprising at first, but that I think makes all the sense when I thought about it, was that the Bible Belt in the US has a higher divorce rate than the kind of liberal coastal areas. Because
Because they marry much earlier, and the later you wed. I mean, there's so much data on this. A recent study came out of 3,000 Americans, and if you marry after 1 year of courtship, between the first and second year, you're 20% less likely to divorce. And if you marry after 3 or more years of courtship, you're 39% less likely to
mm,
divorce. The other thing that points to the marital stability down the road is that they're meeting on the internet as opposed to off the internet. And there was a very interesting study, came out of the University of Chicago a few years ago, and it basically said that if you met somebody on the internet that you married, as opposed to off the internet, you were less likely to divorce.
really,
And I thought to myself, why would that be? What difference does it make if you met in an airport or a coffee shop? So I did my own study, supported by Match, and I looked at 5,000 people, not Match members, and I compared the people who met their last first date on the internet as opposed to people who met their last first date off the internet. And as it turns out, people who met on the internet as opposed to off the internet are more likely to want a committed long-term partnership. And what's important about that is today, 40% of singles met their last first date on the internet. Only 25% met through a friend, less than 10% met in a bar, etc. So not only are we marrying much later, which I call slow love, which is going to lead towards family stability, but we're also meeting on the internet, which is leading to family stability. And I think the third very important piece of information is that we are shedding our agrarian background. We, in front of
mm,
our eyes, the concept of virginity at marriage, the man as the head of the household, arranged marriages, these are going off the globe. They're going. We're seeing the huge trend. By the way, the most modern trend is affecting love is not technology. That's just the newest way to do the same old thing. What's really new is that women are piling back into the job market and becoming better educated, and they can now be picky and marry later.
Mm.
and marry for companionship instead of money. So it's those three things: meeting people on the internet, slow love, marrying later, and women becoming, fully employed and companions in partnerships. I think they're all going to lead to relative family stability.
You're right that there is probably no single tool in human history that wreaked such havoc between women and men or stimulated so many changes in human patterns of sex and love as the plow.
You read my stuff.
I mean, the plow has started getting a lot of bad rap recently and for good reasons. I mean, I think so. As I've understood it, is that if you do agriculture, especially if you do it with a plow, it requires a lot of upper body strength, which is the main sex difference between men and women when it comes to physical capacity. Is upper body strength that is linked to testosterone in puberty, and that with the emergence of plow emerges the reliance on men, on the women rely on their husbands, and therefore divorce becomes basically impossible because where are you gonna? I mean, you need a new husband immediately because you're not going to be using that plow yourself. And so you say that that's actually the origins of how we went from, well, marriage is great, pair bonding is great, but you can have a few partners in life, to the idea of till death do us part.
Well done. Very, very well done. I mean, the bottom line is, man or woman lives on a farm. Well, you can't walk out. You can't cut the cow in half and take it with you. You can't take half the wheat field with you. You stick it out. You have to stick it out. It's pretty much like gibbons, primates. They live in the trees and they form lifelong partnerships. And they do that because they live in the trees of Indonesia, and they live in little territories where there's a certain number of fruit trees, and they basically farm those fruit trees. They stick there, they protect the fruit trees. The male protects other males from coming in and copulating with the female. The female protects the male from other females coming in and stealing the territory, etc. It's pretty much like living on the farm, and they're lifelong pair bonding creatures because they are stuck in individual small territories where you can't go, where you can't leave. Whereas, in our modern world, you can divide up a $10 bill or a euro, for God's sakes, and it's liberated single. You're talking to an optimist. You're talking to a high dopamine woman.
I mean, you were once called America's last optimist, I remember.
Oh, you're really, that's how lovely that you've done your homework here. Thank you. And I think that's good. I mean, I regard myself as a realist. I regard myself as somebody who, sees everything squarely and can call the punches out accurately. But, well, the beauty of today is we don't have the arranged marriages. A lot of the world does have arranged marriages still, but the bottom line is, even in places with arranged marriages, the young man or the young woman can say no. There's almost nowhere where it's child brides these days. Couple, but not much. But the bottom line is, you can express your sexuality and your romance and your feelings of attachment in the way you want to. It's not a cookie cutter world anymore. Now, for example, I got married a couple of years ago. Now I'm in my 70s, but I got married to a magnificent man, 2 years ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I said, I'll be happy to marry you, but I'm not moving in. And we have what I call LAT, living apart together. So he has his home up in the Bronx, and I've got my home and office in Manhattan. And we go back and forth. But 2 or 3 nights a week, I'm here by myself. And it gives me the opportunity to go to bed just when I feel like, eat what I feel like, go out with my girlfriends to the theater, which I'm hooked on, etc. And he's a big reader. And so he likes to be at home reading constantly. We can now make the kinds of partnerships we want to. So, and we can marry later. We got a lot of choices on these internet dating sites. Too many choices. That's the big problem with the dating sites. People binge, and that doesn't work. The brain is not built for binging. But I see not only the liberation of women in our modern culture, but the liberation of men too.
Hmm.
When women take on more roles, men can take on more roles. There's more men who are single fathers. There's more men who can marry later. They've got a companion who's going to bring in money as well as food. I think it's a wonderful time for love.
Well, that's a rich takeaway. I guess one thing we probably should address is whether or not it is natural, quote unquote, for humans to have 3-4 year marriage, then have one child and then divorce. It's certainly not necessarily what we want, or most of us, not for ourselves, not for our friends, not for our partners. I think that one thing that I really appreciate about your attitude is the view that a lot about our so-called casual modern dating culture actually is just peeling back 10,000 years of farming history. So it's not something new. It's just getting back to the old.
That's an important thing that you said. You just said something really important. We're moving forward to the past. We're
Hmm.
moving forward to the lifestyle of our hunter-gatherers gathering ancestors, and I think that's highly compatible with the human spirit. But anyway, I just want to make sure you know how smart you are.
Well, thank you. But I think that the worry is that let's bracket aside the question of how many hunter gatherers actually do divorce after 3 to 4 years. Let's leave aside the question of how difficult it is for their children, for themselves psychologically. It certainly is very difficult in the modern world, and we don't want that to be the norm. I think that what we want there to be is much more liberty in people leaving very bad marriages, and also, let me say, I want. So what I would want to see in the future is more freedom for people to leave bad marriages, much more liberty for people to explore, especially in the early days, do the slow love that you talk about so beautifully. But if we want a long-term satisfying marriages, I mean, you've studied old couples who are still in love. Could you talk a little bit about that? And could you give some tips to those people who don't want to fall into this natural pattern of having a divorce 3 to 4 years into their
Yeah.
marriage and leave one child?
I don't think anybody wants to divorce. It's amazing how people will say, "Oh, well, if you make divorce easier, then everybody's going to do it." That's not the way the human brain works. People walk out of relationships because they really are bad. It's
Sure.
interesting because Andrew Cherlin is a wonderful sociologist, and in one of his books, in the past, the whole concept was to stay married for the children no matter what. And he writes about the fact that, I hope I'm representing him right. It's been a little while since I read his book, but uh, you know, it's much worse for children to stay in a marriage where they come home from school and, mother's got a black eye and is bleeding badly in the bathroom, and dad is on the couch completely drunk. What children need is a stable world with people who they can trust, and some sort of system, regular system for their childhood. And if it's better to be divorce and, all than to marry. And I think most Americans are coming around to that sometimes it's better to
Yeah.
divorce simply because it's going to create a more stable environment for everybody involved.
Or what's the Helen Fisher formula for those who want to understand what a scientist who studied the anthropology, the neuroscience, read about the psychology, have done huge studies on really representative samples of all American population. What does it take to maintain a good marriage? Not just maintaining it for the kids' sake if they have violence, but preventing the violence from ever occurring, from having satisfaction, from not having extramarital affairs. What's the recipe? If that's what people want to do, what would you tell them to do?
Okay, so I will go to what the brain says. Now, there's some wonderful psychologists like John Gottman who would say, don't be critical, don't show contempt, don't be defensive, and don't be stonewalling. So it's base psychology. This is what the brain says. So I and my colleagues put 15 people who were in long-term, extremely happy marriages, and they all would walk into the lab and say, I'm still in love with my partner. Now, these people were all married an average of 21 years. Most of them had adult children. They were all in their 50s and 60s. They would come into the lab and say, I'm still in love with her. I'm still in love with him. Not just loving, but in love. So we decided we would put them in the brain scanner because people don't believe you can remain in love with somebody long term. We put them in the scanner. Sure enough, we found activity in the same brain region, the ventral tegmental area, linked with feelings of intense romantic love. We found activity in a brain region linked with deep attachment. We found activity in a brain region linked with the sex drive. So all three of the basic brain systems were active when they looked at a picture of their sweetheart. But then we looked at people who scored, among these people, those who scored very high on our happiness test. We give them all kinds of questionnaires before they go into the machine. And
By the way, before you say that, can I just point out that I think it's really striking finally, because do I remember correctly that the activity in these areas was equally good than for those who had just fallen in love, that the brain was able to sustain that same level of response after 25 years of marriage. I mean, that's fascinating.
It is. In the long-term love, yes, we found activity in the brain region linked with intense romantic love and with deep feelings of attachment, definitely. But we also found activity in the brain region with calm and pain suppression, which we did not find among those who are very happily and married, very intensely married, only a few months.
I mean, this is
And it,
great news. This is great. It
yeah,
means that it can just get better.
news gets better. Because we took a look at those who were very happy, because you give a whole lot of questionnaires before you put somebody in a brain scan. I mean, this is an enormous operation. And those who were long-term married and extremely happily married, still madly in love, deeply attached, sex drive was cranking along, we found activity in 3 brain regions among these long-term happy marriage. A brain region linked with empathy, a brain region linked with controlling your own stress and your own emotion, and a brain region linked with what I call positive illusions, the ability to overlook what you don't like about somebody and focus on what you do.
Hmm.
So you asked me what makes a long-term happy marriage from the neural perspective. I would say express empathy daily, control your own stress and your own emotions daily, overlook what you don't like and focus on what you do daily. Those 3. And I would also, in my case, I would think you should also keep all 3 of these basic brain systems, sex drive, romantic love, and attachment, cooking along. And to maintain the sex drive, have sex. People say, well, I don't have time. Well, you got enough time to go out for dinner with friends on Saturday night. You got enough time to get your hair done or get your work done. You have time for sex. Make time for sex, even if you schedule it. Scheduling it can be sort of fun, because then you can joke about it beforehand.
Hmm.
Uh,
And you said that I've heard you say that it's good for the body. I mean, that it's actually.
Very good for the body. Very good for body. You know, when you have sex with somebody, any stimulation of the genitals drives up the dopamine system, can give you feelings of renewed romantic love. With orgasm, there's a real flood of oxytocin linked with feelings of attachment, and androgens go up. Testosterone goes up. So if you have sex, you're going to want more sex as these people get out of the habit of having sex, and so it declines. So have sex regularly. So that's also having sex with your partner increases the endorphins for pain relief. The pain threshold goes up 10%. You get glowing skin. You look better.
What if your partner doesn't want?
Well, now you got a problem. That's one of the big problems in therapy.
Mm.
Is one person wants it more than others. There's no question about that. But if everybody does want it and you're having it regularly, it also boosts the immune system, good for heart rate and respiration and blood pressure, promotes sleep, gets oxygen to the brain, elevates mood, and it's certainly good for the muscles and everything. So, have sex, number 1. Well, first of all, breast them, have sex. Keep that sex drive going. Keep man love going. And you do that with novelty, novelty, novelty. Do new things with the partner. Now, you don't have to swing from chandeliers. Take your bicycles out to dinner. Go to a different place in the summer vacation. Read a new book together. Cook something different. Learn to dance. Novelty, novelty, novelty drives up the dopamine system and can give you feelings of intense romantic. This is why vacations are so exciting.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't know about you, but it's hard to even figure out how you turn on a shower in some of these hotels. And as you're trying to turn on the shower, it's novel. Dopamine is going up. You're beginning to focus. And, and certainly also you want to boost the oxytocin and vasopressin. You want to keep that attachment going. And in order to keep the attachment going, stay in touch. Kissing drives up oxytocin. Walking arm in arm. Get rid of the 2 separate chairs in the living room and sit together on the couch. Hold hands when you walk down the street. Figure out how to lie in each other's arms at night, or come home from work and lie down holding each other for half an hour and talk about work or whatever, instead of sitting across the lobby from each other, for God's sake. So basically, it's those 6 things: empathy, controlling your own stress and your own emotions, overlook the negative, focus on the positive, positive illusions, keep the sex drive going, novelty, 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 driving up dopamine, and stay in touch for attachment. And there's one more that really interests me.
Hmm.
wonderful study that showed that when you say nice things to your partner, it it's helpful for their cholesterol, their cortisol, and their blood pressure, but it's also good for yours. So I think the number 7 of all these things is say nice things to your partner.
There's one thing that I do have to ask when it comes to long-term relationships and maintaining them, which is the possible links between antidepressants and long-term love. Could you quickly give your, 2-minute elevator pitch on your take on the matter and any tips that you have for people who are on SSRI medications at the moment or are considering them?
Yeah, I really think that there's some people who need these medications to get out of bed and not kill themselves or somebody else. So I'm not saying that they're bad for everybody all the time, but I wrote a big academic paper on this and the impact that they can have and what SSRIs do, not SNRIs, not serotonin and norepinephrine, but solid serotonin, Prozac, Paxil, Lexapro. They drive up the serotonin system in the brain. And what they do with when you take a lot of it is they numb the emotions. And what you're doing is you're driving up serotonin, you are reducing dopamine. You're making it less likely to be able to fall in love or to sustain a long-term partnership. Now, there's some people who need these drugs to stay alive, but the bottom line is they are jeopardizing their brain systems for romantic love and deep feelings of attachment. And I have just started my next brain scanning experiment to show this. And what happened it was about 2 weeks ago, I got 2 emails from somebody who said, Dr. Fisher, can't you help? She said, there's these huge groups now of
Mm.
people, and as much as 20 years later, they write and they've written to me now and said, "I can't feel my vagina, my clitoris. I can't feel it at all. I
Mm.
can't feel no sensations in my genitals, men as well as women. I don't feel any real joy or sorrow. I don't feel anything." And they're desperate to have somebody take a look at the impact of these drugs on the brain and on the body. And it's so interesting. I made a speech at the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. It was years ago. I was talking about this, and then the New York Times printed something about it, and they printed the story of a doctor, an MD, who had heard my lecture from Texas. And he wrote in, he said, I'm a person who does suffer chemically from real depression. And I love my wife and I love my children. And I started taking one of these drugs. And I woke up one morning a few weeks later and I realized I don't love my wife. I don't love I don't like anything about any of this. And he said, I felt completely numb. And
Mm.
he said, I began to realize that it was the drug. And he said, and then he writes this in the New York Times. He says, I now am going to not take these drugs when I get seriously depressed because my wife and my children are more important to me. I'm going to go through those depressions because the rest of my life is so essential. I cannot afford to lose it. And the problem with these people is that who take these drugs is they stay on them. Now I can understand taking them. I got this one letter from a guy and he was doing poorly in school. He was heavily in love with a girl. And he started to do poorly in school. They put him on one of these drugs. He realized he didn't love the girl. He walked out. He finally got off the drugs almost a year later. His passion for the girl came back. In his case, that's lucky. And he bought all the roses he could carry in his arms and went over to her house. And she opened the door and he said, I think I made a terrible mistake. It was the drugs. Will you take me?
Sure.
And
Mm.
I have almost a foot of single pages of emails from people around the world because I mentioned this in one of my TED Talks, and I did write a big academic article about how these drugs can affect not only your sex drive, but your sexual performance
Mm.
and your ability to form an attachment to somebody.
Quick question. What about SNRIs? Would it just solve the problem with SNRIs?
I certainly, I think that they would be much better. I don't study it, and I do need to study it. I've been very involved in something else for the many last few years, but now that I've launched this thing with SSRIs, an fMRI study, I'm gonna have to study up on them, but it's got to be an improvement. I mean, I'm not a doctor. I'm a PhD in anthropology, so not a doctor, and I hope the people listening really remember that. But the bottom line is just from a purely physiological perspective, norepinephrine is very closely related to dopamine,
Mm.
and they can both, help with sex drive because they can trigger the testosterone system.
Even quicker question, how uncontroversial is the link between serotonin and dopamine, this inverse relationship?
It's in all the medical textbooks.
Mm,
It has nothing to do with Helen Fisher. I just read it. I've never
mm,
studied it myself.
mm.
I just read it in
Uh,
medical textbook, and then I read a huge amount about SSRIs. I have huge folders of it, and it makes you calm. That's why people take it. Makes you calm because it's driving up serotonin. And
mm.
then you read carefully, and I read one article and it said it disrupts exploratory behavior. You're less curious.
I mean, it just sounds to me like even without knowing much about the brain, if you're depressed, you don't necessarily want to get rid of your dopamine system was working properly.
Some people need calm. They just need the calm, and they need the calm to sort out the problems without being, I mean, some people will take Wellbutrin instead, which drives up the dopamine system and does not affect the serotonin system. And some people get on the serotonin for a while and they will say, this really worked for me. I was able to put my life back together and I finally got off it. And now I'm happily married. So it's going to be different for different people. But I would just at least have doctors say to the patients, look, there are studies, and just have them read my article for God's sakes, so that these people at least know what they're getting into. And some of them will say, I don't care. I don't want to fall in love. I need to be numb. I need to get through this stage in my life because of some horrible thing that's happened to me. I'll get off these drugs and get back, to myself at a later date. And that's that you don't have to make these decisions, but you need to be informed. And what horrified me was 2 weeks ago when I got two letters from this woman saying, you've got to do something because I'm part of a group, and there's these groups all over apparently of people who took these drugs years ago and the numbness never left. They don't feel.
Mm, mm, mm,
And I wrote my academic article with a psychiatrist called Andy Thompson. And he once said to me, he said, I know somebody's really in trouble when they come into my office, they're on these serotonin boosters, and they don't cry when their mother died.
mm,
I now know they're taking too much of this drug.
mm, mm, mm. Well, that's one of the claims that I most hope is not true because it's I mean the amount of people on these drugs nowadays is
It's huge. It is absolutely huge.
and they're not informed about this.
No, they're not informed because doctors, I don't know, a lot of doctors aren't even familiar with the brain system for romantic love and attachment.
Well, we can end this somewhat sad caveat, which has a lot of hope because at least if there's more information, there's more to be done. Before we end, I would like to return a little bit to the more anthropological, evolutionary anthropological side of things. I mean, I don't think that we can have really a discussion about anthropology of love without going through a little bit of the kind of variation in human communities around love. So we talked about how romantic love, we find it everywhere. You find it everywhere where you look. Talked about how is we probably have the wrong picture if we assume that everybody everywhere is in a lifelong monogamous relationship. Most people don't even understand the term monogamy. It's much more complicated. We've heard your theory about serial monogamy with a little bit of adultery on the side being probably the most natural prehistorically to humans. But what about when we look into the societies around the world? I mean, one of the claims that people might come back with is to say, yeah, okay, we're not like chimpanzees. We have pair bonding. But nor are we like foxes. We're like gorillas. We build harems. 86% of societies you have polygamy, and I think in almost all of these, it's one man being able to have a lot of wives, which is what gorillas pretty much do. I mean, they build a harem and then they stay there. you don't regard that as the most as the best I mean, you don't regard gorillas as the best model for what is natural for human love. So I think that just returning once more to that topic that we started with, what is the data on different mating systems around the world, monogamy, polygamy, etc., and how do you interpret, for example, this gorilla challenge, if we may call it
Right.
that?
Okay. First of all, 86% of world cultures do permit a man to have several wives. But when you look carefully at it, only about 5 to 10% of men actually succeed in having more than one wife.
Or even want to? I mean, who knows?
Yeah, yeah, you gotta have a lot of chickens, a lot of goats, a lot of cows, a lot of fruit trees, a lot of land, a lot of power in order to have more than one woman share your bed. And when you go into these societies where there are men who have multiple wives, wives fight. Sometimes they try to poison each other's children. It's not a natural pattern. And it's very interesting that, just because these societies permit it,
Mm.
there's various scientists will say, oh, well, this is the norm. It's not the norm. Even though something is permitted, the vast majority of men do not succeed in having several wives. You've got to have a great deal of power and resources to do that. So only about 5 to 10% of men actually end up having several wives. And in parts of West Africa, traditionally, about 25% of men could get several wives. But in those societies, wives fight, etc. And a perfect example occurred to me. I was traveling in the highlands of New Guinea, and in the most beat up van, I went with a former boyfriend, and we were picked up. In fact, on that was a tiny little plane flying over the highlands, and there were 6 of us on the plane. And one guy got in; he was painted all yellow, and was carrying his bow and arrow, and a 6-foot plant. But anyway, the bottom line is, I was traveling in the back of this really beat up van, sitting on an old rusty drum. I could have put my feet right through the floor onto the dusty, just the unpaved road. Anyway, there were 2 men, 2 Highlanders in the van with me, in the back of the van. My boyfriend at the time was in the front with the driver. Anyway, I asked one of them, who I knew he had 3 wives,
Mm.
and I said to him, I said, "How many wives would you like?" And there was this long pause. And I thought to myself, "What is he gonna say 5? Is he gonna say 10? Is he gonna say 25?" And he looked at me and he said, "None." And bottom line is it's a toothache. And then the guy next to him, he said, "What you can never have 2 wives. You either have 1 wife or 3 or more, because when you have 2 wives, every time you're out of town, that wife knows where you are and why get jealous." So the bottom line is we are not like gorillas. Do you know, among gorillas, they travel with a harem. And at puberty, a male will break off from his main troop unless there's somebody there he can get as a wife. They move away, and so do the young females. And they'll run into each other in the woods and they'll form a partnership. But if that male gorilla doesn't find a second female and a third and a fourth, the first one will leave. They are predisposed for polygyny.
Females want to that.
Yes, the females will not tolerate a male to be just monogamous, having just a
Jesus.
pair of bonds. They need more females in the group. Whereas among people, yes, societies do permit polygyny, one man and several wives, but wives fight, and it can be a real toothache. Now, there's another thing, polyandry, one woman and several husbands. It's very rare for a Darwinian reason, because a woman can't have a new baby every time, whereas a man with several wives can have, a lot of children all at the same time, a lot of pregnancies all at the same. Women can't do that. So from a Darwinian perspective, it's not very adaptive, and you see it only under particular circumstances.
These are really fascinating examples. Could we quickly go through the Tibet one first? Because I would like to talk more about the Alaska one. Maybe I can just paraphrase. Am I correct that there in some areas in Tibet, when you have landowning families, they don't want to break up their estates, and therefore they marry all their sons to one wife so that they will only have one female producing offspring, which will then inherit that same estate.
Very well said and very concisely, much more concise than mine. Um, yeah, the ethnography that I read about it explaining it, but there's more than that. The oldest son, the young girl comes in and she's, really the wife of the oldest one, but he's the wife of all three of them. Well, one of them is 9 years old. She's not going to have sex with him. And another is a late teenager or so. And then there's a guy in his mid 20s. But yes, they all marry the same woman because the plots of land are so small that if all three sons were to take a wife and
Mm,
divide up the land, nobody could even
mm,
grow a tomato,
mm,
too
mm,
little. So what happens in these things is they all have one social wife, but the younger sons will have, women in the village that they have family with, but they don't inherit. So that's a reason for polyandry. On the Northwest coast, of Southern Alaska, it's a very different reason, and maybe you wanna say it better than I can.
Well, I mean, what I remember is that there you have this situation where the men typically do the hunting and the fishing. I think it was fishing mainly. It's almost like a blue collar, white collar job division where the men produce the basic goods, but the women have taken the role of traders. You know, the white collar workers who are
That's right.
who are trading these goods, therefore amass more status and wealth, and there you end up seeing them just having more husbands because that's what you can get when you have status and money. Is that a fair description?
It's a perfect description. Yeah, because the men can be gone fishing for quite a long time, and then they come back, they've got all these goods, and there's a classic, photograph of a woman sitting in the back of the boat, these long boats, and all the men are doing the rowing with all kinds of they do a lot of hunting too, by the way, and so they're trading skins, they're trading oil, they're trading blubber, they're trading all kinds of things, and it's the woman who's the
Mm,
trader, and they
mm,
can get very rich. And there's a lot of people on the planet that would rather share a wife who is rich
mm, mm.
than marry somebody very poor and living a different environmental life. So, yes. But you do have to have extreme circumstances for polyandry. And you do have to have a whole lot of resources if you're going to collect a lot of wives. So, if you were to go around the world counting heads, how many people are in this teepee, in this tenement, in this lodge, in this da da da? The vast majority of both men and women on Earth have one partner at a time. They may have several partners during their life, serial monogamy, but one partner at a time.
One of the questions I most wanted to ask is, what would be, in your opinion, I mean, you read, and as I said, an incredible amount of these ethnographies of love. What is the closest that you've come across to a society which would live somewhere along the lines of polyamory, where it is not a formalized one man can have many wives, or one wife can have many men, or one husband can only have one wife, or in homosexual cases, one husband can have another husband, but it's always one. What would be the closest that you would get to this kind of more open, fluid? There is just, you just do whatever you want. You guys kind of figure it out. If somebody wants to be pair bonded to one, go ahead. If some people want to have a love triangle, go ahead and do it. If some people want to share a bed, the four of them, um, you know, three from one sex, one from another, go ahead and do it. When you read these ethnographies, what would be the closest that you get?
New York City.
New York City. What about in traditional societies? Great answer, of course, but what about in traditional?
Well, in up the Amazon, there are some societies that have what they call partible paternity. And in those societies, a woman has one social husband. But they actually believe that in order to get pregnant, she needs the seed of lots of different men. And so it's absolutely common for her to have sex with a lot of different men.
And sorry, where do you find this?
In west of the Amazon River.
Mm, mm, mm,
And I don't study partible paternity, but it's always fascinated me. But apparently I really there's people that know a lot more about this than Helen Fisher, that's for sure. But just look up particle, paternity, and you will find these cultures in the Amazon, and they truly believe that in order to get a baby, you need the sperm of a lot of different men. And, that's actually rather adaptive when you think
yeah,
about it,
yeah.
only because if all of the men in the village think that that baby is partially theirs, they're going to spend a lot of time protecting that.
I was joking about this the other day. I we were talking about this with my sister actually, and I said that I think this is one of the best illusions you could have. I mean, this just sounds fantastic. Everybody's in the same team, everybody's kid. They're just there like high-fiving each other, and everybody seems to be pretty happy. I don't know if
And
everybody is happy, but I'm saying that
see,
it does
that's the
sound like
point.
it's an adaptive
That is the point. And I've always been tempted. I got to read more about particle paternity because the bottom line is, jealousy is human. I mean, this is a
Mm,
human brain system. I've not ever been able to study jealousy. I'd like to study jealousy, but anything that you feel has some sort of, something in the brain. So there
mm,
is some sorts of patterns to jealousy, and all kinds of other animals are jealous too. So the bottom line is, here is where a cultural practice has to supersede a natural human predisposition.
mm,
Culture is very powerful. I mean, we got people who are basically predisposed to be adulterous, settle down on a farm for 10,000 years. I mean, we're built to sort of pick our own partners, and we got a lot of cultures with arranged marriages. I mean, culture plays a big
mm,
role. I have to be more interested in the biological basis of behavior, probably because I'm an identical twin. And growing up as a twin, I always knew that there was biology to my behavior. You cannot be an identical twin
mm.
without everybody. By the time I'm 4 years old, people were asking me, do you have your same friends? Do you like the same food? Do you have the same cavities in your teeth? I mean, long before I knew there was a nature nurture issue, I was already engaged in that
Mm,
world. And in fact, that's why I went to study love. When I was in graduate school, people they kept on telling all of us that, the mind was an empty slate in which environment, inscribed personality. I knew it wasn't true. I knew it because I was an identical twin. And so when it came time to write my PhD dissertation, I thought to myself, okay, Helen, if there's one part of our behavior that would have a
mm.
biological predispositions or biological basis, it would
It's
have to be our reproductive patterns.
yes.
Because as Darwin would have said, if you have 4 children and I have no children, you live on and I die out. No, there is this concept of kin selection. You're, you share your DNA with relatives and they have babies too. But the bottom line is, if if our ancestors weren't somehow programmed, predisposed to fall in love and form a partnership and raise their babies at a team, they would die out.
Mm. But I
And
guess
there
a
would
really important point there is to remember that there is one thing is what are the traits that evolution has selected for, but another thing, what kind of traits an individual human has. And I think one of the cases that best describes is adoptive parents or people in happy homosexual partnerships are not there in order to play the Darwinian game. I don't think any of us is explicitly there in order to play the Darwinian game. And I think that's, first of all, just a good reminder so that people don't interpret us in the wrong way. But I also wanted to ask about homosexuality. What do you think? Homosexual love, you said, it looks exactly the same in the brain scanner than heterosexual love. Um,
yeah,
that's great. Why do you think it evolved? I mean, this might go into the realms of pure speculation, but
yeah.
yeah, what's the natural history of homosexuality in humans?
That's one of the first questions for years people asked me. I could count on that when I made a speech. Now they ask about the future because I'm chief
Okay.
science advisor to Match, but it was always why homosexuality, and this is the things that I know. Um, there was a wonderful study of Hawaiians, and one of the hypotheses was that, okay, gay men, for example, won't have their own children, but apparently they give more resources and education and energy to their relatives' children. And they were able to prove that in a Hawaiian community that gay men did expend more of their money on their sisters' children, and their sisters do share some of their DNA, probably about
Mm.
50% of it. So the bottom line is they are helping to reproduce some of their DNA simply by giving their resources and energy to their kin.
You don't think that it could be just a kind of benign byproduct in the sense that we evolve with this deep passionate longing for that one mate. And in some, well, it's not like we are explicitly playing an evolutionary game. And for some people, it just happens to be that, the parameters of what kind of a mate they prefer are very loose. So they are bisexual. For some people, it's tightly in the realm that the kind of like Darwinian demon would want it to be. And in some others, it's just pretty far from what the Darwinian demon might be. And that's fine because evolution is not perfect. It's not crafting us to be the perfect
Yeah.
replicators. It's just giving us a raw template of genes that build proteins that build an organism. So you don't think that would be enough to say?
This is what the data is,
Mm,
that gay men expend more of their resources on their sisters' children. So that's
mm,
one thing. The other thing that I read, it was some time ago, is that about 20 percent of gay men ended up having children anyway.
mm,
And about 40% of gay women tended to have children anyway. So
mm,
that's direct selection.
mm, mm,
And so basically, it wasn't weeded out.
Yeah,
And
yeah, no
looking
problem for the Darwinian demon.
Yeah, from a Darwinian perspective, it wasn't. I mean, people who, babies that come out of the womb with 2 necks are weeded out. But other biological, compositions of the brain aren't weeded out because they're not really deleterious.
Mm,
Either you find homosexuality even in birds. You find
mm.
it in ducks, you find it in horses, you find it in cats, you find it in chimpanzees. And so
We certainly find it in bonobos.
oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're very sexy.
Yes, yes. But I would maybe call them pansexuals, I guess. They don't seem to.
Yeah. Well, they're pansexuals. Um, and it's quite adaptive. That's the way they make friends,
Yeah,
and that's the way how they create, community stability.
yeah.
And these things are adaptive. So I can't say that homosexuality is unadaptive. I would think that, anybody looks carefully at it, that I mean, there's been enough Darwinian payoffs
Mm, mm.
that it hasn't been selected against.
Yes,
And
yes.
of course, these days, everybody can express anything they want. So I stick with my thing. Where do you see more? What was your question? Where do you see more sort of all of the experiments? New York City. Maybe Helsinki. I don't know.
I think New York maybe even more. But I don't think it's actually just about the culture. I think that, I mean, already Bertrand Russell said that one of the reasons that, I think in 1940s or something, he wrote a book called Marriage and Morality. And I think I read it as a young kid and I was getting interested in philosophy. And I think that the one takeaway I took from the book was that I never took contraception seriously enough as a culture shaping mechanism. I mean, you hear about the pill being discussed as part of the feminist movement, but I also think that one of the reasons why something like New York City polyamory might not have existed to the extent that you're right that it hasn't quite existed before might be because, well, before having good quality contraception, it's a pretty serious deal. Who's made whom maybe we now live in a truly new era in a sense that it's pretty safe, at least in New York City.
But don't forget, I'm in the Oneida community up in
Mm.
upstate New York, and there was 150 of them, and everybody was allowed to copulate with anybody, and you weren't allowed to pair off. And by the way, it didn't work.
It didn't work, but they were not allowed to pair off. I think that the idea of the polyamorous communities would be that no, you're absolutely allowed if you want to, but you don't have to. Like, we were not saying that this is what you have to do.
Right. Well, we're at a time when people can do a lot of experimenting, but even in a world with all of these experimenting, people fall in love, they form partnerships, they raise their babies as a team. It will survive as long as we survive as a species. We are built to love.
Well, that's a wonderful place to start into a close. Is there anything that you would have wanted to discuss that we haven't had time yet?
Well, you're absolutely incredible. No, and I really should go on with some other things in my day, but you're charming and absolutely fascinating. And it's beautiful to see a person who's really done the reading. That's lovely. I haven't had a conversation like this maybe since Krista Tippett, but she didn't get into it the way you did.
Well, thank you so much. That means a lot. That means a lot. Thank you so much. I have one final question, which I like to ask all guests. After a long career of studying the human animal, what do you think has changed most in your thinking about, us, about what kind of animals are we?
Hmm. I'm sure lots of things. I mean, I lie in bed and I think to myself, what do I believe today that I won't believe in 5 years? I'm always wondering, is this crazy? You know, um, But one thing that happened to me recently, you know, I've I intellectually understand romantic love and attachment, not only the brain circuitry, but around the world, the evolution of it, written 6 books on it, written a great deal out now, most recently on personality. But I never wanted to marry. I always thought to myself, it's just a sheet of paper. I've always sort of slept with my sneakers on, thought to myself, well, it's easy to get out if things are not, and I've always had a very long-term relationship with one man, over 20 years, and then another for about 20 years. But I never wanted to marry them. And I always had this idea that a marriage license should be like a driver's license with an expiration date. And that way, if you didn't like your partner, you didn't have to fight about anything. It was just going to naturally expire. Did like your partner, it would keep you on a daily level of keeping it going. And it was about a year ago. And I had done a study of this on my Singles in America study at Match. And I asked people, would you like to have a marriage license like a driver's license? I'm astonished that almost nobody said yes. I thought to myself, well, why is this? So anyway, I was doing a piece of television. It was about a year ago. And then my new husband and I went out for dinner. And we were sitting there in a little Mexican dump restaurant, delicious food. And I was telling him about the fact that, during this TV interview, I had talked about a marriage license like a driver's license. And he looked at me and said, do you still believe that? And at that moment, I said, no, I don't believe it. What was I thinking? And I finally, intellectually, I've always understood the sex drive. I've always understood romantic love. And I've always intellectually understood profoundly deep attachment. And now I finally understand that too. Not only intellectually, but emotionally. That's something that changed. I look at men's wedding rings, particularly men's wedding rings, and I feel a sense of cosmic understanding of them that I never would have had.
Professor Helen Fisher, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for sticking with us until the very end of this conversation. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can either share it with them directly or just mention next time you met that you heard something they might enjoy. If you have any thoughts about this episode, other episodes, things that we should cover in the future, things that I might have screwed up, things that you want to hear more about, or just want to say hi, please feel free to drop me a line. You can do it either via the podcast website or sending me an email to makela.ilari@outlook.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from listeners. But that's all for now. Until next time, take care.